So why is it that some nations can get hit by a massive crisis and actually emerge stronger, while others just collapse? Well, it's not about luck, and it's not just about wealth. It's about what you could call a nation's immune system. Today, we're going to do a high-level briefing on a new framework designed to measure that system, the Resilience Scoreboard 2.0. But here's the key. This isn't just about resilience, bouncing back to where you were. This is about being anti-fragile, the ability to actually get stronger from the shock itself. All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at why old metrics like GDP are failing us. Then we'll really dig into that core concept of anti-fragility. After that, we'll explore the cascade effect, how modern crises spread like wildfire. From there, we'll decode some of the key parts of the scoreboard itself and then analyze its most critical piece, something called the governance multiplier. And we'll wrap up with maybe the most important point of all, how this is meant to be used as a diagnostic tool, not some kind of trophy. Before you can build a new model, you really have to understand why the old one is broken. For decades, we've all relied on these big, simple metrics like GDP. But we're about to see exactly why that's become dangerously insufficient when a real shock hits the system. So this is the central question we have to answer. Why can a country look incredibly rich on paper, but be so brittle in reality? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple, but it's profound. GDP measures economic activity, not economic adaptability. And in the world we live in now, a world of constant disruption, adaptability is pretty much everything. Let's look at a tale of two economies to really see this in action: Saudi Arabia and South Korea. Back in 2014, they had similar GDP per capita. They looked about the same on paper. But when oil prices collapsed, Saudi Arabia's oil-dependent economy was incredibly fragile. It was forced to just burn through its reserves. Meanwhile, South Korea, with its complex, diversified, innovation-driven economy, barely even felt the shock. The takeaway here is stark. It's the structure of the economy, not the sheer size of it, that actually counts. And it's not just GDP, by the way. Think about massive military spending. The US has the most powerful military in the world, right? But it was completely powerless to stop a virus. Or what about high scores on human development? Japan consistently scores highly, but it's facing this cascade of vulnerabilities from its aging demographics. You see the fatal flaw? These old metrics, they measure strength in these isolated silos. They are totally blind to how a nation handles modern interconnected shocks that just cascade right across those silos. Okay, so if the old way of measuring is broken, what's the alternative? This brings us to the intellectual core of the entire scoreboard. It's all built on a fundamental shift in thinking, moving away from just resilience and towards a much more powerful concept, anti-fragility. So let's be really precise with our language here. Anti-fragility, a term coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, is not the same as resilience. Resilience is about bouncing back to where you started. Anti-fragility is about getting stronger because you were hit. It's about using stress, disorder, and volatility as fuel for improvement. Here's a really simple way to think about it. Imagine a fragile system, like a crystal glass. Under pressure, it shatters. A robust system, say a plastic cup, resists that pressure and just stays the same. But an anti-fragile system, that's like a human muscle. It actually grows stronger after being broken down by stress. So the goal here isn't just to survive a crisis, it's to evolve because of it. Now let's apply this theory to a real-world stress test. Back in 2008, Iceland's banking system didn't just collapse, it pretty much evaporated. But they used that massive shock as a catalyst. They restructured their entire economy, they strengthened regulations, and by 2011 they were growing faster than they were before. They literally gained from disorder. Now, contrast that with Greece. It faced similar shocks, but its rigid, fragile system just broke, and it has been paying a very heavy price ever since. Okay, so we've got the concept down. Now let's look at the threat model. Because to measure anti-fragility, you have to understand the real nature of modern crises. And their single defining characteristic is that they are never, ever isolated events. This is really the central thesis of the entire framework. A nation isn't a collection of independent pillars. It's a network. And a failure in one area, like a major cyber attack, doesn't just stay there, it cascades. So continuing to treat our different sectors like separate silos is basically a recipe for disaster. And listen, this isn't just some abstract theory, it's a quantitative model. The scoreboard actually measures this domino effect using what it calls transfer coefficients. Just think of it like a probability score for how one crisis triggers another. For instance, the data shows that when a nation's cyber systems get hit, there's a 65% chance that damage will transfer over to its physical infrastructure. And when that infrastructure fails, 40% of that impact cascades into trade. This domino effect is real, and it is absolutely measurable. If you want a perfect and, frankly, tragic visualization of a cascade, you don't have to look any further than the 2021 Texas freeze. The very first domino to fall was the energy grid. But that failure didn't stay contained. No, it cascaded almost instantly to the water supply as the treatment plants lost power. Then it cascaded to transportation as gas pumps stopped working. In a matter of days, a single sector failure brought the entire state's economy right to its knees. That is a cascade. So how does the scoreboard actually go about measuring this national immune system? Let's pop the hood and decode its architecture. Now, we're not going to cover all 10 domains, but we are going to focus on a few of the most counterintuitive ones. First up, let's talk about demography, which is weighted at a pretty significant 14%. And this isn't about raw population size. No, it's about population structure, which is this slow-moving but incredibly powerful force that creates systemic pressures that no government policy can just easily wish away. And the key insight here is that demographic risk is kind of like a vice. It can squeeze you from both ends. An aging population like Japan's creates this slow-motion crisis, right? A shrinking tax base, soaring healthcare costs. But a massive youth bulge, like in India, can also be a huge source of fragility, creating instability through unemployment and potential unrest. The anti-fragile sweet spot is having a balanced age structure. Okay, let's move on to another key domain, production complexity. This one's weighted at 11%, and it really fundamentally challenges our obsession with GDP. This quote just nails it perfectly. It is not about how much money you make, it's about what you make. Does your economy produce potato chips, something pretty much anyone can make, or does it produce microchips, something very few nations can? You see, a complex economy like Germany's can absorb shocks because it has options. A simple, specialized one, like oil-dependent Venezuela, it just breaks. We've now arrived at what is, without a doubt, the single most important mechanism in this entire framework. This is the factor that can either amplify a nation's strengths into a massive advantage, or it can reduce all those advantages to dust. We are talking about the governance multiplier. And here is the master formula. The final score is not just adding up all the parts. It's the core score, all of a nation's resources and capabilities multiplied by its governance factor. And what that means is that your resources are only as good as the system you have to deploy them. You can have great assets, but with poor governance, they're just wasted. So what is this multiplier made of? Well, it combines your traditional institutional quality, things like rule of law, control of corruption, with something a bit newer, social cohesion, or simply trust. This focus on trust is a direct lesson learned from the brutal stress test of the pandemic. Think about it. New Zealand and the UK have pretty similar institutions, but New Zealand's high-trust society enabled a really effective response. Meanwhile, the UK's low-trust environment crippled theirs. Trust is a strategic asset, period. And the impact of this is just stunning. This number, 42.4%, that represents the potential performance gap between a country with the very best governance and one with the very worst, even if they have the exact same underlying resources. Good governance is a massive force multiplier, and poor governance is a dead weight that will sink everything else. So this brings us to the ultimate point of this whole thing. This scoreboard is not designed to create some global league table for bragging rights. No, its sole purpose is to be a diagnostic tool, a way for a country to find its hidden vulnerabilities before a crisis does it for them. You know, when you adopt this framework, it leads to a totally different way of thinking about policy. You start focusing on cascades, investing where the positive network effects are strongest. You build in optionality, because having multiple energy suppliers is way better than having one most efficient one. And you learn to embrace your constraints, using limitations to force the kind of innovation that creates true, lasting advantages. And so this entire framework really leaves us with one provocative and I think essential question. It challenges every leader, every analyst, every single citizen to look in the mirror and ask, are our policies, are our investments designed to fight the last war? Or are we building the deep, systemic, adaptive capacity we need to thrive through the next unknown crisis? Because in an era that's defined by volatility, that is the only question that truly matters.